The Wendel sisters, Ella Virginia and Mary Augusta, were born into extraordinary privilege in New York City in the late 19th century. Today, the Wendel name is associated with one of the most enigmatic chapters of American wealth, a family whose fortune once ranked among the largest in Manhattan's real estate market. But before they became symbols of reclusion and urban legend, the Wendels were diligent property magnates whose disciplined investments shaped large sections of Midtown New York. Their ascent began in the early 1800s, rooted in the precise accumulation and management of land by patriarch John Jacob Wendel, later consolidated by his son, Jacob, and eventually John Gottlieb Wendel. What set the Wendels apart was their cautious approach to wealth, marked by rigid legal controls and a culture of privacy that would later define the family's legacy. Over time, the sisters' world contracted into the confines of their decaying mansion, a deliberate withdrawal from modern society, even as the city outside transformed. Their lives became an emblem of inherited isolation, sustained by legal instruments and unwavering adherence to family rules. Before we begin, please comment where in the world you're watching from. I'd love to know that this story is being watched from all around the globe. The origins of the Wendel family in New York City can be traced to the early 19th century, with the arrival of John Jacob Wendel from Germany. His decision to settle in Manhattan occurred during a period of rapid urbanization and demographic change. Historical records confirm that by the 1842, John Jacob had transitioned from his initial mercantile endeavors into property acquisition, a move that proved prescient as the city expanded northward. The Wendels' strategy emphasized the purchase and long-term retention of land rather than short-term commercial speculation. Their first holdings were concentrated in areas just above the established city core, at a time when Manhattan's population was pushing north from its colonial boundaries toward what would become Midtown. The family's preference for real estate over commerce set them apart from contemporaries who often sought fortunes in shipping or manufacturing. By the mid-19th century, the Wendels had begun acquiring additional parcels on what were then the outskirts of the city. Land records from this era detail purchases in blocks that would later become some of the most valuable in Manhattan. The Wendels' pattern of ownership favored contiguity and consolidation, allowing for efficient management and the potential for future development. The family maintained a low profile, engaging in few public-facing activities and limiting their involvement in civic affairs. Unlike many other German-American families of their generation, the Wendels invested little in philanthropic or social organizations, choosing instead to operate primarily within their own household and business circles. Their approach to property management was deliberate and methodical, with leases structured to ensure steady income and minimize risk. Throughout the 1852 and 1860s, the Wendel estate expanded through targeted acquisitions. Surviving correspondence and business records indicate a preference for cash transactions and an aversion to indebtedness. This caution allowed the family to withstand the financial disruptions of the Civil War era, including inflation and volatile real estate markets. By the end of the 1860s, the Wendels were established as significant landowners in the city, although they remained largely absent from the ranks of New York's social elite. The consolidation of holdings into a family trust ensured that property would remain under Wendel control, discouraging partition or sale except under exceptional circumstances. This legal structure would later become central to the family's internal dynamics and long-term strategy. As the 19th century progressed, Jacob Wendel, son of John Jacob, assumed primary responsibility for the management of family assets. Jacob's administration was characterized by a further tightening of family discipline, both financially and domestically. He reinforced the policy of non-alienation of property and introduced strict oversight of household affairs. Jacob's contemporaries described him as reserved and meticulous, rarely seen at public gatherings or in the city's burgeoning social clubs. The family's real estate portfolio expanded to include parcels along what would become Fifth Avenue, anticipating the transformation of the area from residential streets to commercial boulevards. The Wendels' holdings appreciated in value as New York underwent successive waves of immigration, industrialization, and real estate speculation. During this period, the Wendel family's German heritage continued to influence their private and business lives. The household maintained traditional customs and communicated primarily in German well into the late 19th century. Family gatherings and business meetings were held in the mansion that would later become central to the sisters' story. Marriage within the family was carefully regulated, with an emphasis on preserving both property and cultural identity. This insularity, both social and economic, allowed the Wendels to navigate periods of upheaval with relative stability. By the time of Jacob's death, the foundations of the family's later reputation for privacy and control had been firmly established. The cumulative effect of these early decades was the creation of a substantial and resilient estate, positioned to benefit from New York's ongoing growth. The family's avoidance of public life and their preference for discretion over display set the stage for the developments that would follow in the 20th century. The Wendel approach to property and family organization, grounded in the choices of John Jacob and solidified by Jacob, shaped both the opportunities and constraints faced by subsequent generations. The transition from immigrant origins to established landowners was accomplished without fanfare but left a permanent mark on the structure of the family and the landscape of Manhattan. As the city entered a new era of development, the Wendels' legacy of methodical accumulation and guarded privacy would become increasingly distinctive, influencing the circumstances that defined the later years of the family and their celebrated mansion. By the latter part of the 19th century, Jacob Wendel had consolidated leadership of the family's expanding estate. His tenure was marked by a continuation and amplification of the prudent business methods introduced by his father. After formally assuming control of the family assets, Jacob implemented a structured management system designed to minimize risk and ensure continuity of ownership across generations. He placed particular emphasis on retaining every parcel of land acquired, resisting pressures to sell even when property values spiked during speculative booms. Contemporary property records indicate that the Wendel holdings increased incrementally through the 1,872nd and 1,882nd, particularly in the districts that would later comprise Midtown Manhattan and the emerging garment sector. Jacob's policies also dictated that leases were to be preferred over outright sales, thereby guaranteeing a steady stream of rental income and preserving the underlying assets. Within the domestic sphere, Jacob maintained strict control over household operations. Census records and household account books from this period reveal a regime of thrift and close supervision. Staff were kept to essential numbers, and expenses were scrutinized personally by Jacob or a designated family member. Jacob's insistence on economy extended to personal conduct. Family members were expected to avoid ostentatious consumption, public displays of wealth, and unnecessary social entanglements. Invitations to join civic organizations or charitable societies were routinely declined, reinforcing the family's low profile in New York society. This approach distinguished the Wendels from other property-owning families, who often pursued social advancement through philanthropy or public service. Jacob's reputation among his business peers was that of a cautious and reliable landlord. Records from municipal and commercial archives show that he was consistent in meeting tax obligations and maintaining clear title to all properties. The avoidance of debt was a cardinal principle. The family estate carried no mortgages, and capital improvements were funded from accumulated income rather than external loans. When economic downturns struck, such as the Panic of 1873, the Wendel estate suffered less than many competitors, owing to this conservative financial posture. These practices provided stability during periods of uncertainty and contributed to the steady appreciation of the family's assets. The internal structure of the Wendel household reflected Jacob's disciplined outlook. Decision-making authority rested almost exclusively with him, but he ensured that his children, including his son John Gottlieb and 6 daughters, were thoroughly educated in both household management and the essentials of property law. Family meetings addressed matters ranging from lease renewals to investment in infrastructure improvements for their properties. The children were expected to participate in administrative tasks and to understand the significance of maintaining unity in financial matters. Marital prospects were discussed in the context of their potential impact on the family estate, with an emphasis on discouraging alliances that might threaten the cohesion or control of the assets. Jacob Wendel's approach extended to the structuring of legal arrangements designed to bind the estate together for future generations. He worked closely with attorneys to draft trusts and restrictive covenants intended to prevent the piecemeal sale or division of the family's holdings. Provisions were established to ensure that, in the event of his death, the estate would pass intact to his children under agreed-upon terms. These legal mechanisms were seen as both a safeguard against external threats and a means of reinforcing internal discipline. As the century drew to a close, the effectiveness of Jacob's methods became evident. The Wendel estate remained largely unfragmented, with all key parcels held under a single legal entity. Family members had become accustomed to a life of comfort but not extravagance, shaped by the routines and expectations established by their patriarch. The transition to the next generation would take place against this backdrop of stability, control, and deliberate seclusion. Jacob's legacy, as both the architect and enforcer of these structures, would profoundly influence the decisions and behavior of his heirs, particularly in the years following his death. The Wendel model of disciplined, methodical expansion had succeeded in preserving wealth, but at the cost of increasing insularity, setting the stage for the developments that would define the family in the 20th century. When Jacob Wendel died in the late 19th century, the administration of the family estate transitioned formally to his only son, John Gottlieb Wendel. John, born in 1860, had spent his early adulthood involved in the operational aspects of property management, learning firsthand the priorities and methods that defined his father's tenure. Upon taking control, John introduced additional measures to safeguard the unity and value of the family holdings. He immediately enforced a policy that had significant consequences. All 6 of his sisters were required to remain unmarried and to reside together in the family mansion at 442 Fifth Avenue. This mandate, which was discussed and documented within family legal correspondence, was intended to preclude the division of assets that often accompanied marriage settlements or dowries. The decision marked a turning point in the internal structure of the Wendel household. John maintained authority over all real estate transactions, delegating only routine management tasks to attorneys and property agents. Lease negotiations and disputes with tenants were addressed personally or by trusted intermediaries. The emphasis on strict control was evident in the deliberate avoidance of any new acquisitions that might complicate the portfolio, focusing instead on maximizing the value and rental yields of the existing properties. John's approach also involved periodic reassessment of rental contracts and selective improvements, but he remained firmly opposed to large-scale redevelopment or sales, even as offers increased in frequency during periods of urban growth. Within the mansion, daily life became increasingly structured and inward-looking. The sisters, each educated and accustomed to the routines established by their parents, adapted to a lifestyle in which personal autonomy was secondary to the preservation of the estate. Household activities followed a regular pattern, with responsibilities divided among the siblings and a core group of staff. Social engagements outside the family were rare, and the sisters' participation in broader civic or charitable activities was effectively non-existent. Visitors were limited to essential business contacts and legal advisors, reinforcing the isolation that now defined the Wendel residence. Documentation from staff records and family correspondence confirms that by the turn of the 20th century, the mansion was operated with efficiency but also with an increasing sense of separation from the city around it. John Gottlieb's rationale for these policies was rooted in a fear of external interference and a belief that family unity was paramount for the retention of wealth. Estate documents and private letters reflect his concern that the introduction of outsiders through marriage could undermine legal claims and expose the family to litigation or forced sales. He took additional steps to formalize this approach, drafting wills and trust agreements that reinforced the expectation that the sisters would not marry and would continue living together. The arrangement was unusual even among conservative New York families of the period and became the subject of quiet commentary among business associates and legal peers. The broader impact of these policies was felt most acutely by the sisters themselves. While public records show no evidence of overt dissent or legal challenge, the consequences of John's decisions were profound. The women retained some agency within the bounds of the household, but their opportunities for personal relationships and public life were sharply curtailed. The estate remained financially secure, but the cost was a steady narrowing of the family's social world. John's model of governance succeeded in keeping the Wendel properties intact during his lifetime, as no sales or significant disputes were recorded in estate ledgers and legal filings. Rental income remained steady, and the estate's conservative financial structure withstood fluctuations in the city's real estate market. As John Gottlieb Wendel grew older, the routines he had established became ever more entrenched. The sisters continued to fulfill their prescribed roles, and the mansion retained its character as a private enclave, largely impervious to the modernization and social changes that characterized early 20th century Manhattan. By the time of his death in 1914, John's policies had become the defining features of the Wendel household. The estate was handed to his sisters under the same strict conditions, ensuring that the model of disciplined, insular management would persist into the next generation. The stability he achieved for the family fortune was matched by an unprecedented degree of seclusion, marking the Wendel family as increasingly atypical even among their most tradition-bound peers. In 1914, following the death of John Gottlieb Wendel, control of the family estate passed exclusively to the surviving sisters: Ella Virginia, Mary Augusta, Rebecca, Georgiana, Harriet, and Henrietta. This transition, recorded in probate filings and contemporaneous legal documents, marked a new phase of consolidation rather than change. The sisters, now in sole possession of one of Manhattan's most valuable residential portfolios, made no significant alterations to the internal governance or external management of their assets. They retained the legal and business advisors who had served the family under John Gottlieb and maintained the established practice of handling all property matters by correspondence and documented instruction. Offers from developers and real estate speculators, which intensified during the city's economic boom years, were uniformly declined without negotiation, according to records held by the family's attorneys. Inside the mansion, the sisters' routines became more rigid and self-contained. Housekeeping operations were further reduced in scale as staff numbers dwindled through attrition and retirement. Rather than recruiting new employees, the sisters redistributed duties among themselves and the remaining trusted servants, whose tenures often spanned decades. Household expenses were managed with the same caution that had long characterized Wendel administration. Repairs and improvements were delayed unless absolutely essential. The building's infrastructure, already aging, continued to function with only occasional intervention from outside tradesmen. Receipts and repair logs from this period indicate a preference for patching and preservation over replacement. Social withdrawal, already pronounced during John Gottlieb's era, now became almost total. The sisters declined all invitations from social acquaintances, philanthropic societies, and church groups. Letters sent to the mansion requesting donations, attendance, or public comment typically went unanswered. The family's participation in city life diminished to the bare minimum required by law, such as the payment of property taxes and compliance with municipal codes. Mail and other deliveries were handled exclusively at the service entrance. Face-to-face interactions with outsiders were rare. By the 1922, local directories and society columns no longer listed the Wendel sisters as active members of any civic organization. As family numbers decreased through the natural course of aging, the daily pattern inside the mansion shifted accordingly. When Henrietta died in the late 1910s, followed in close succession by Rebecca and Harriet, only Ella and Mary remained. Estate documents from this period show that the two sisters assumed full authority for both household and property management. The rooms once occupied by their siblings were closed, with personal effects inventoried and stored rather than dispersed or donated. The practice of retaining all family belongings, regardless of use or condition, became a hallmark of the household. Despite the mounting value of their real estate holdings, Midtown property prices rose sharply during the 1922 economic expansion. The sisters continued to reject all offers to lease, sell, or redevelop any portion of their estate. Letters from real estate firms, some offering record sums for even minor parcels, were consistently answered with polite refusals drafted by the family's attorneys. The sisters' determination to maintain the estate intact, as stipulated by the legal frameworks inherited from their brother and father, was unwavering. Press reports of the period occasionally speculated about their motivations, but no interviews were granted and no public explanations offered. Externally, the physical decline of the mansion accelerated. With only 2 occupants and minimal staff, areas of the house fell into further disuse. Maintenance was restricted to the rooms necessary for daily living and to essential exterior repairs required by city ordinance. The remainder of the structure, including formal spaces and upper stories, was left undisturbed, with furniture and possessions remaining as they had been during the family's earlier years. The sisters' world thus contracted to a few serviceable rooms on the ground floor, while the rest of the house became a sealed archive of Wendel family history. By the close of the 1922, the Wendel sisters had achieved a degree of withdrawal unprecedented even within the tradition of their family. Their decisions, consistently documented and systematically implemented, ensured that the estate remained unified and private. The cost, however, was an increasing degree of isolation, both from the city whose fortunes their real estate helped shape and from the social currents of their time. The events of these years set the stage for the final phase of the Wendel story, in which the estate's value would continue to grow even as its physical and human presence faded from the city's view. By the early 20th century, the Wendel Mansion at 442 Fifth Avenue had become the family's principal residence and the physical embodiment of their approach to wealth and privacy. Originally constructed in the mid-19th century, the four-story brownstone occupied a prominent corner at 39th Street, a location that would become increasingly valuable as Manhattan's commercial core shifted northward. The house, designed in a restrained architectural style and set back from the avenue by a modest garden, was notable not for its ostentation but for its solid construction and sense of permanence. For the Wendel sisters Ella, Mary, Rebecca, Georgiana, Harriet, and Henrietta, the mansion functioned as both home and stronghold, a space where the rules and routines established by their father and brother could be observed without interference. The daily operation of the mansion reflected the family's preference for self-sufficiency and order. Household staff, once numerous, had been gradually reduced over the years to a core group responsible for essential duties: cooking, cleaning, maintenance, and security. The sisters personally supervised many aspects of the home's management, relying on detailed ledgers and regular inventories. Expenditures were tightly controlled, repairs and improvements were deferred unless strictly necessary, and new amenities were rarely introduced. Even as technological advances such as electricity, central heating, and modern plumbing became standard in neighboring homes, the Wendel Mansion adopted such changes only when older systems became unserviceable. The sisters' focus was always on preservation and continuity rather than comfort or display. The internal arrangement of rooms within the mansion mirrored the gradual contraction of the family. Large formal spaces, such as the ballroom and multiple parlors, saw little use as social events diminished. Several upper floors and service areas were closed off entirely, their contents left undisturbed for years. The sisters concentrated their activities within a handful of rooms on the main floor, which were maintained in functional but unadorned condition. Personal effects, inherited furnishings, and family portraits remained largely untouched, contributing to an atmosphere described in later inventories as both orderly and static. Despite the scale of the house, life within its walls became increasingly quiet and restricted as time went on. Social interactions beyond the household were limited almost exclusively to matters of business and necessity. Deliveries were accepted at the service entrance, and vendors were required to present written invoices for approval. Legal advisors and property managers visited only by appointment, conducting their affairs in the mansion's study or, more often, through correspondence. Invitations to social gatherings, charitable events, or civic functions were declined as a matter of routine. The sisters' public appearances were infrequent, generally confined to short walks in the immediate neighborhood or rare outings for medical appointments. Accounts from neighbors and contemporary press reports confirm that the Wendel sisters were seldom seen outside their home, reinforcing their reputation for privacy. The house itself gradually became a source of curiosity within the surrounding community. As commercial development accelerated along Fifth Avenue and high-rise buildings replaced many of the street's older residences, the Wendel Mansion stood out as an anomaly, an undivided, owner-occupied home amid a district increasingly dominated by businesses and rental properties. Observers remarked on the property's unchanging appearance and the absence of visible activity. Maintenance was limited to the essentials. The garden was kept tidy, windows were repaired as needed, and the facade was repainted only infrequently. City inspectors occasionally noted minor code violations, but these were quickly addressed to avoid official attention. By maintaining the mansion as a closed environment, the Wendel sisters insulated themselves from the economic, social, and technological changes reshaping Manhattan. The routines and restrictions of their daily life continued largely unaltered even as the outside world became more modern and dynamic. The sisters' decisions, informed by family precedent and personal inclination, ensured that the house retained its original character well into the 20th century. The mansion became not only a symbol of their inherited wealth, but also the physical expression of a strategy designed to limit risk, exposure, and outside influence. The result was a form of self-imposed seclusion that defined both the property and its occupants, further distinguishing the Wendel family from their contemporaries as the years passed. By the 1922 and into the 1930s, the neighborhood surrounding the Wendel mansion underwent significant transformation, a process thoroughly documented in municipal development plans, building permits, and real estate market reports of the period. The once residential corridor of Fifth Avenue, especially around 39th Street, evolved into one of Manhattan's most commercially dynamic districts. High-rise office towers, retail establishments, and luxury apartment buildings replaced the brownstones and single-family homes that had characterized the avenue in previous decades. The result was a landscape of dense urban development, marked by construction activity, increased pedestrian and vehicular traffic, and a rising cost of land and property. Amid this accelerated urbanization, the Wendel mansion remained conspicuously unchanged. City planning records and period photographs indicate that by the mid-1920s, the mansion stood as one of the last private, owner-occupied residences in an area otherwise dominated by commercial interests. The house's continued presence generated both curiosity and frustration among developers, many of whom sought to acquire the land for new projects. Offers to purchase or lease the property increased steadily, with some proposals exceeding previous market highs. However, the sisters' attorneys, acting on their explicit instructions, refused all such overtures, maintaining the family's long-standing policy of non-alienation. Written correspondence preserved in legal archives confirms that the sisters declined negotiations regardless of the financial incentives presented. The increasing isolation of the mansion was not merely symbolic. The environmental and logistical challenges of living in a rapidly urbanizing district became more pronounced. City directories and utility records from the era detail rising property taxes, municipal assessments, and service charges, all of which placed additional administrative burdens on the estate. The sisters responded by maintaining meticulous records and paying obligations promptly, thereby avoiding legal complications but declining to take advantage of any opportunities for redevelopment or collaboration with municipal authorities. Their determination to preserve the mansion as a private residence was absolute, even as the advantages of such a stance diminished. The changing character of the neighborhood also affected the sisters' daily routines. Noise, dust, and congestion from nearby construction projects encroached upon the quiet order that had previously defined their home. Reports by local officials, as well as occasional notes in community association minutes, described the property as an anachronism, a reminder of an earlier, more residential Fifth Avenue. The sisters further curtailed their already limited activities outside the house. Shopping, religious observance, and even walks in the neighborhood became increasingly rare as the district's population shifted toward office workers and transient renters. Despite these pressures, the Wendel sisters persisted in their chosen mode of life. Their resistance to change, though sometimes described as eccentric by the press and local business leaders, was consistent with the legal and cultural precedents set by their forebears. The mansion's appearance, a well-tended garden bordered by commercial signage, shuttered windows in the shadow of modern towers, became a subject of urban folklore. Rare interviews with their staff or legal representatives emphasized the family's commitment to privacy and autonomy rather than any intention to obstruct city progress. By the end of the 1930s, the practical and symbolic isolation of the Wendel property was nearly complete. The sisters' refusal to adapt to external developments reinforced their identity as private custodians of a vanishing way of life. The estate's real estate value continued to rise in tandem with the city's relentless growth, but the family's physical and social presence within the community steadily diminished. The contrast between the sisters' enduring routines and the relentless transformation of their surroundings marked this period as a critical juncture in the history of both the family and the district. The foundation was laid for the next phase, in which the practical consequences of such seclusion would become increasingly difficult to manage, and the future of the estate would be shaped by external events as much as by internal resolve. As the 1,920 seconds progressed, the gradual decline in the number of Wendel siblings within the mansion had measurable effects on both the household dynamic and the administration of the estate. Henrietta Wendel's death in the late 1,910 seconds, closely followed by the passing of Rebecca and Harriet, reduced the original group of sisters to just Ella and Mary by the end of the decade. Each death was dutifully recorded in local vital records and, as mandated by the terms of various Wendel wills, prompted a formal reassessment of internal responsibilities. The probate of the deceased sisters' personal estates was conducted with discretion, in keeping with the family's tradition of privacy, and personal effects were inventoried, catalogued, and stored within the unused portions of the mansion rather than dispersed outside the family. This approach preserved a sense of continuity, but further contributed to the atmosphere of contraction within the household. The shrinking household staff, a result of retirements, deaths, and the refusal to hire replacements from outside the family's circle of trusted employees, led to a further consolidation of daily routines. Surviving staff records from the period show a decrease in both the number of resident servants and the scope of their duties. Chores and household oversight were redistributed between the remaining sisters and loyal staff, sometimes requiring the Wendels themselves to participate in tasks previously delegated. The reduced activity within the mansion was matched by a corresponding narrowing of the sisters' personal world. Reports from neighbors, tradespeople, and the rare visitor describe a house that had grown noticeably quieter and more withdrawn, with large sections left closed or undisturbed for years. Social engagement, already minimal in earlier decades, became almost non-existent. Ella and Mary ceased attending public gatherings or church services and declined invitations from remaining acquaintances. Written correspondence, once maintained with a small network of extended relatives and former family friends, tapered off as both the sisters and their correspondents aged. The isolation was by choice and design, consistent with the policies set by John Gottlieb Wendel and maintained by the sisters themselves. Press coverage of the sisters during this period remained sparse, as the family continued to refuse interviews and withheld any personal statements about their private lives. Physical access to the mansion was increasingly restricted. Deliveries were received at specific times, and tradespeople were admitted only for essential repairs, always under supervision. The few remaining staff members functioned as gatekeepers, ensuring that the sisters' seclusion was not interrupted by unsolicited visits. Inventories of the estate from the late 1,920 seconds and early 1,930 seconds confirm that entire floors were left unused, with contents covered and catalogued but otherwise untouched. The main living quarters were reduced to a small number of functional rooms on the first floor, where the sisters managed their daily affairs and kept up a limited correspondence with attorneys and business agents. Despite the contraction of their world, the Wendel estate continued to function as a major economic entity in New York. Rental income was collected, legal matters were addressed promptly, and all municipal obligations were met in full. Yet the sisters themselves became increasingly invisible within the community, known largely by reputation and the rare sightings reported by neighbors or staff. Their withdrawal was systematic and comprehensive, affecting all aspects of their social, personal, and business lives. By the end of the 1,920 seconds, Ella and Mary Wendel had become, in practical terms, custodians of a legacy defined by both material abundance and profound solitude. The mansion, once filled with siblings and activity, now served as a secure but shrinking enclave for the last two heirs. The conditions created by the loss of family and the steady reduction in outside contact would inform the final decade of the Wendels' presence in New York, shaping not only their daily existence but also the ultimate fate of the estate and its remarkable, if reclusive, history. By the onset of the 1932, the physical state of the Wendel Mansion had become a conspicuous element in the changing Midtown landscape. Documentary evidence from municipal inspections, insurance surveys, and property tax appraisals of the period indicates a pattern of ongoing neglect across much of the building. While the sisters continued to occupy and maintain a handful of rooms on the first floor, the remainder of the four-story structure saw little attention beyond the most basic preservation measures. Paint and wallpaper, once carefully chosen, were now faded and peeling in disused corridors. Stained glass and ornate woodwork survived more from inertia than intention, as the sisters prioritized frugality over restoration. Roof leaks, plumbing issues, and outdated wiring were addressed only when absolutely necessary, often in response to formal notices from city authorities. The steady decline was not the result of financial hardship but of a calculated decision to limit expenditures and interaction with outsiders. Bills and receipts from this era, preserved in estate archives, reflect a consistent reluctance to authorize anything beyond minimal repairs. Household accounts show that maintenance budgets shrank in proportion to the reduction in occupied space. Essential systems such as heating and lighting were kept operational in the rooms used daily by Ella and Mary, but many parts of the house were effectively mothballed. Surviving correspondence with contractors confirms that access to the mansion was tightly controlled and limited to trusted service providers, most of whom had served the family for years. This deterioration did not go unnoticed by neighbors, city officials, and, occasionally, the press. As commercial towers and modern apartment buildings rose around the old brownstone, the mansion's appearance became a subject of local commentary. Property value assessments began to note the disparity between the house's location, now among the most desirable in the city, and its increasingly dilapidated state. City inspectors filed periodic reports recommending improvements, citing fire hazards and warning of the risk to public safety should structural neglect continue. The sisters, through their attorneys, typically responded promptly to such notices with just enough remedial work to avoid penalties or legal action, but they refused all suggestions of large-scale renovation or sale. Photographs from the early 1930s capture the incongruity of the property, a dignified but visibly aging residence amid the relentless pace of Midtown construction. The garden, once a source of family pride, became overgrown, except for a few trimmed paths. Windows remained shuttered. Ironwork rusted slowly on balconies and fences. The front steps, polished by decades of use, now saw only infrequent foot traffic. Only the delivery entrance and the pathway to the small side door showed regular signs of maintenance. The public, increasingly aware of the mansion's slow decline, began to associate the Wendel sisters with eccentricity and resistance to change. Press articles, while respectful of the family's privacy, occasionally speculated on the reasons behind their withdrawal and the visible neglect of their inheritance. Such coverage was met with silence or firm denials from the sisters' legal representatives. City authorities, lacking legal grounds to intervene in private property affairs, limited their involvement to code enforcement and tax assessment. Inside, the shrinking domain of Ella and Mary Wendel remained tidy and well-organized, reflecting their enduring commitment to routine and order. However, the scale and opulence that had once marked the house as a symbol of the family's prominence now existed only in memory and the untouched, dust-covered relics stored in closed rooms. The contrast between the mansion's public face and its private reality became starker as the decade advanced. The visible deterioration of the Wendel Mansion thus paralleled the social and familial withdrawal of its occupants. This process, thoroughly documented in property records and third-party accounts, marked a further stage in the transformation of both the estate and the legacy of its owners. The physical decline set in motion a series of municipal inquiries and renewed public interest, presaging the legal and administrative developments that would follow in the next phase of the Wendel story. By the late 1930s, the pattern of daily life within the Wendel Mansion had become even more constricted, reflecting both the aging of the sisters and their unwavering adherence to a long-standing regimen of privacy and self-containment. Contemporary accounts from legal correspondence, household expense ledgers, and the few surviving reminiscences of longtime staff illustrate the steady narrowing of the sisters' physical world. Ella and Mary Wendel limited their activities almost exclusively to a small cluster of rooms on the ground floor, using the remaining spaces only as necessary for the storage of documents, family possessions, and the residual effects of their deceased siblings. The upper floors, once alive with family life and household staff, remained closed, dust-covered, and largely undisturbed. As age and infirmity advanced, the sisters relied increasingly on a reduced number of domestic workers. Household accounts from this era record the employment of just 2 or 3 long-serving staff members responsible for all aspects of cleaning, cooking, and minor maintenance. Outside medical assistance was arranged through private physicians who visited on a strict schedule, always through the rear entrance, and rarely stayed beyond what was required. Pharmacy deliveries, laundry, and groceries were handled by trusted vendors, often with arrangements set in place years prior. All staff were required to sign confidentiality agreements, and their interactions with the sisters were limited to essential matters. Such measures further deepened the atmosphere of seclusion. Administrative matters continued to be managed with characteristic diligence. Bank statements, tax bills, and legal correspondence were reviewed and approved by Ella and Mary, usually after being screened by their attorneys. Surviving legal records confirm that the sisters maintained direct signature authority for all financial and legal transactions, a practice that underscored their continuing autonomy even as physical frailty increased. They communicated with their legal team exclusively through written notes and scheduled meetings, eschewing telephone conversations or any engagement that might compromise their privacy. All financial affairs, including property management and investment of estate funds, were handled in accordance with protocols established decades before. Public visibility of the sisters diminished to almost nothing. Neighbors and building superintendents in the rapidly commercializing district around Fifth Avenue rarely glimpsed the 2 elderly women. When illness required hospitalization, it was conducted with utmost discretion and always accompanied by the family's attorney or a trusted staff member. The sisters ceased all participation in civic or charitable activities, and requests for interviews or public appearances were consistently declined. Obituaries of distant acquaintances and the dwindling number of former friends went unacknowledged, as the Wendel sisters kept their focus solely on the preservation of household order and the legal integrity of their estate. The mansion's exterior showed ever more evident signs of age and isolation. Maintenance was confined to immediate safety concerns, leaking gutters, damaged window panes, or minor roof repairs handled quietly and with minimal disturbance. Notices from the city regarding code compliance or taxes were addressed promptly by the sisters' attorneys, avoiding any grounds for outside intervention. Only essential visitors were admitted, and then only with advance notice and under-staff supervision. The garden became increasingly overgrown, symbolic of the retreat from engagement with the outside world. Despite the physical and social contraction of their lives, Ella and Mary Wendel preserved a routine that revolved around their long-standing values of privacy, order, and cautious stewardship. The records of these final years depict a household suspended in time, insulated by legal and familial precedent from the tumultuous changes taking place just beyond its walls. By the time the sisters' health began its final decline, the groundwork for the ultimate disposition of the estate had been laid, and the Wendel legacy was already transitioning from a living family presence to a matter for legal administration and public record. These final years of seclusion marked the closing phase of a century-long narrative defined as much by what the Wendels chose to exclude from their lives as by what they built and preserved. Throughout the 1,920 seconds and 1,930 seconds, the Wendel sisters continued to oversee one of the city's largest and most valuable private property portfolios from within the confines of their Fifth Avenue mansion. The mechanics of their financial management, reconstructed from tax receipts, bank ledgers, and legal correspondence, reflected an ongoing commitment to discipline, privacy, and procedural regularity. The sisters did not interact directly with tenants, brokers, or city officials. Instead, the administration of rental properties and the processing of lease agreements were conducted through established channels involving the family's long-standing attorneys and property managers. The principal legal firm, whose identity remained consistent for decades, handled all external negotiations and was empowered to act on the sisters' behalf in both routine and exceptional matters. Monthly and annual accounts were prepared and reviewed in writing, with decisions requiring the sisters' signatures routed through trusted intermediaries. Every new lease, rent increase, or repair authorization passed through layers of documentation, with copies preserved in both the legal office and the family's own files. The sisters insisted on approving all major expenditures, and meeting minutes show that regular audits were performed to confirm that no unauthorized changes had been made to property terms or rental rates. This approach maintained an unbroken chain of control over the estate's income streams, even as the economic environment of New York City grew more volatile in the years preceding the Great Depression. The sisters' reluctance to modernize their internal processes was matched by their avoidance of outside investment. Surviving financial statements make clear that nearly all profits from the rental portfolio were reinvested in the maintenance of existing assets or deposited into conservative savings accounts. The family's business advisors occasionally proposed diversification into equities or the purchase of government bonds, but these recommendations were either ignored or formally declined. The preference for liquidity and predictability over potential growth opportunities underscored the Wendel tradition of risk aversion. When tax assessments or legal challenges arose, such as disputes over zoning changes or eminent domain proposals, the sisters' attorneys responded with prompt and detailed documentation, often successfully defending the estate's interests, without recourse to public proceedings. Financial conservatism extended to charitable giving and discretionary spending. Records of the period show few, if any, donations to public institutions or religious bodies. Requests for contributions were typically forwarded to legal counsel for polite refusal, citing the family's commitment to private management and the absence of a formal philanthropic mandate. The household itself functioned with minimal expense. Bills for food, utilities, and essential services were paid from current rental income, and no significant debts were incurred. The sisters maintained their reputation among business contacts for reliability and punctuality, but avoided all publicity or engagement with the expanding world of New York's civic and commercial affairs. Despite the challenges posed by inflation, shifting tenant demographics, and citywide regulatory reforms, the Wendel portfolio remained profitable and structurally intact. The sisters' financial discipline allowed them to weather the fluctuations of the late 1920s and early 1930s without significant disruption. Rental income, although impacted by broader economic downturns, remained steady due to the premium location and the desirability of their properties. Their legal team managed property tax appeals and ensured compliance with evolving municipal codes, further insulating the estate from external pressures. Reports filed with the surrogates court during annual reviews consistently described the Wendel finances as sound, liquid, and securely managed. The end result of this approach was a remarkable degree of continuity in both family wealth and household operations. While neighboring families sold or redeveloped their holdings to adapt to a changing city, the Wendels preserved the structure and management of their estate as it had existed for decades. The stability achieved through this cautious approach ensured that the sisters remained independent of financial distress, even as their social isolation deepened and the world around them underwent dramatic transformation. This chapter of financial management and seclusion reinforced the family's reputation for discretion, autonomy, and unwavering adherence to inherited precedent, a pattern that would continue until the very last years of their residency in the mansion. Mary Augusta Wendel, the last surviving sibling, died in 1931 at the age of 80, formally concluding a chapter in both her family's internal history and the evolution of New York real estate. Contemporary death notices, probate filings, and legal affidavits documented the passing with accuracy and a certain clinical detachment. The death certificate was issued without delay, and attorneys representing the estate notified the appropriate municipal and state authorities. The event, though expected by those familiar with the sisters' advancing years and failing health, triggered the immediate activation of carefully constructed legal protocols that had been refined over decades. These included the appointment of designated executors, the unsealing of the final will, and the preparation of a comprehensive inventory of all personal and real property in accordance with New York probate requirements. Public reporting on Mary Wendel's death emphasized the extraordinary nature of the family's retreat from modern life and the unique preservation of their holdings. Journalists noted that, despite their vast fortune, the Wendel sisters had not participated in the social, philanthropic, or political spheres that define New York's other leading families. Coverage in both local and national newspapers often focused on the symbolism of the decaying mansion amid the city's relentless upward development. The property's value, now estimated in the millions, was contrasted with the sisters' well-documented frugality and deliberate refusal to modernize. The story of the Wendel sisters' final years rapidly became a touchstone for broader commentary on the changing nature of wealth and inheritance in 20th century America. In the weeks following Mary's death, legal teams began the exhaustive process of accounting for the estate. Inventories compiled by court-appointed appraisers listed extensive real estate holdings, securities, cash reserves, household furnishings, and a considerable archive of personal papers, letters, and legal documents. The vast majority of the family's assets remained intact and unencumbered, the result of decades of consistent management and risk aversion. All known claims against the estate were reviewed by the surrogate's court, and notice was published to allow distant relatives or potential creditors the opportunity to file petitions. The will, as anticipated, made detailed provision for the orderly transfer and ultimate liquidation of all properties and assets, specifying the hierarchy of beneficiaries and naming charitable organizations among the recipients. The immediate aftermath of Mary Augusta Wendel's death was marked by a high degree of procedural formality. The mansion, now vacant, was secured by representatives of the executors, who supervised the initial inspection and cataloging of its contents. Photographs and detailed descriptions of each room, item, and document were assembled for submission to the court. The house, frozen in a state of arrested decline, was quickly recognized by the press and the legal community as a rare surviving example of the city's pre-modern elite residential architecture, but its ultimate fate would be determined by economic rather than sentimental considerations. In the public eye, the Wendel estate's settlement became a symbol of the challenges posed by large, undivided inheritances in the modern city. Legal commentaries and editorials describe the sisters' lives as both a triumph of discipline and an anachronism out of step with the entrepreneurial spirit of the age. Within a few months, the legal machinery was in motion for what would become a lengthy and contested probate process, as claimants, charities, and government agencies positioned themselves for a share of the vast holdings. The death of Mary Augusta Wendel thus marked not only the end of a singular domestic arrangement, but also the transition from private to public control of one of Manhattan's great fortunes. The era of the Wendel sisters, marked by unwavering adherence to privacy, unity, and a deliberate withdrawal from city life, closed quietly, its legacy entrusted to legal institutions and public record rather than personal memory or family continuity. As the 1,930 seconds progressed and the Wendel sisters' seclusion deepened, the legal structures governing the estate became both more significant and more intricate. The absence of direct heirs following the deaths of the other siblings required the surviving sisters, Ella and Mary, to address the complex questions of inheritance, succession, and the future stewardship of their substantial holdings. Contemporary legal correspondence and probate documents show a sustained engagement with trusted attorneys who had represented the family for decades. Together, they reviewed existing wills, drafted codicils, and periodically amended trust instruments to reflect changing circumstances and to reinforce the sisters' wishes regarding the undivided preservation of the estate. Central to these preparations was the question of continuity in the face of mortality. With no children and no immediate family remaining, Ella and Mary were forced to anticipate a range of scenarios involving distant relatives, charitable organizations, and potential challenges from outside claimants. Legal counsel advised the creation of explicit succession plans, naming individual executors and trustees, some from among their long-standing legal advisors, to oversee the management and ultimate liquidation of the estate should both sisters die without direct heirs. Extensive documentation from this period details efforts to ensure that all titles were clear, that accounts were current, and that provisions existed for the smooth transfer of authority to the designated executors. Municipal authorities and charitable institutions, aware of the estate's value and the sisters' advancing age, began to express interest in the eventual disposition of the assets. Public records from City Hall and local courts note increasing inquiries and, in some cases, petitions to be included as beneficiaries in any charitable bequests. The sisters, however, refused all direct engagement on these matters, preferring to conduct all negotiations through their attorneys and to keep the terms of their wills strictly confidential. Private correspondence between legal counsel and city officials indicates that the Wendel's legal team was meticulous in responding to all statutory requirements while revealing as little as possible about the ultimate plans for the estate. Potential complications also arose from the nature of the family's property holdings. With parcels spread across different districts of Manhattan and subject to a patchwork of zoning regulations and tax assessments, the process of cataloging, valuing, and securing each asset became increasingly burdensome. Attorneys worked in close consultation with city surveyors, accountants, and insurance representatives to create a comprehensive inventory. Special attention was given to ensuring that the properties remained free of encumbrances, liens, or unresolved legal disputes that could complicate probate proceedings. Throughout these years, the sisters maintained their policy of declining all offers to sell or redevelop any part of the estate. Written instructions to attorneys emphasized the importance of keeping the family's holdings unified until the final disposition could be handled according to their explicit terms. The resulting trust documents, reviewed and updated multiple times during the 1,930 seconds, stipulated that only after the death of both sisters could the estate be liquidated and the proceeds distributed in accordance with the established hierarchy of beneficiaries. Detailed notes from these legal meetings demonstrate a methodical, even clinical, approach to the process, devoid of sentimentality but keenly aware of the potential for dispute. The final years of legal preparation also saw a gradual increase in public scrutiny. Journalists and local business leaders speculated openly about the fate of the mansion and the broader Wendel holdings. While the sisters themselves remained silent, their legal representatives issued occasional statements confirming the estate's solvency and compliance with all applicable laws. The cumulative effect of these actions was to place the future of the Wendel estate firmly in the hands of a small group of professional executors, shielded by a carefully constructed framework of trusts, wills, and legal precedents. This meticulous legal groundwork ensured that, regardless of the eventual course of events, the transition from private to public stewardship of the Wendel assets would be executed in accordance with the sisters' wishes and with minimal disruption. It also marked a critical turning point in the family's story, as the mechanisms for ending a century-long legacy were methodically put in place, signaling the close of the Wendel era and the impending redistribution of its considerable wealth. The death of Mary Augusta Wendel set in motion a protracted and intricate probate process that became one of the most notable legal affairs in New York of the early 1930s. Upon the filing of her will and the accompanying inventories of the estate, the surrogate's court in Manhattan began the formal process of authenticating documents, verifying titles, and determining the exact scope of assets under administration. The scale of the estate, which comprised dozens of parcels of prime midtown property, substantial cash reserves, securities, and the mansion itself required a thorough and systematic approach by the court-appointed executors and legal advisors. Every property deed, lease agreement, and bank account was reviewed for accuracy and current standing. Accountants, surveyors, and real estate professionals were retained to value the holdings and ensure all records met legal requirements. As required by law, notice of probate was publicly posted, inviting any person or entity with a possible claim against the estate to come forward. This standard procedure resulted in a wave of petitions from distant relatives, some previously unknown to the Wendel legal team. In addition, several charitable organizations and public institutions submitted formal requests to be considered as beneficiaries, citing the sisters' lack of immediate heirs and the substantial size of the bequests allocated for philanthropic purposes in the will. Attorneys representing competing parties initiated legal challenges that examined every element of Mary Augusta's testamentary intent, with particular attention paid to codicils and any revisions made in the final years of her life. Court records from the period document the complexity and length of the proceedings. Some claimants sought to invalidate the will on technical grounds, while others pursued specific entitlements based on familial relationships or past agreements. Judges reviewed genealogical evidence, historical correspondence, and the testimony of longtime advisors to determine the legitimacy of each claim. The estate's attorneys, drawing on decades of documentation, produced a comprehensive archive of family records to support the validity of Mary Augusta's bequests. Throughout the process, the executors adhered strictly to the procedural requirements laid out in state probate law, ensuring that no transfer of property or funds occurred without judicial approval. Parallel to the legal contests over the will, municipal officials took a keen interest in the future disposition of the Wendel holdings. Zoning authorities and urban planners examined options for integrating the valuable parcels into city development schemes, while the mansion's condition prompted periodic assessments for code compliance and public safety. City tax assessors coordinated with the estate's representatives to verify the accuracy of outstanding obligations, confirming that the Wendel sisters' tradition of financial rectitude had left no unpaid debts or liens. During this period, the mansion remained unoccupied and under the protection of court-appointed custodians. Inventories were updated to reflect any changes in the property's condition, and the building itself became a point of reference in news reports on the estate's progress through probate. Journalists, legal analysts, and members of the public followed the case with interest, recognizing its significance as both a legal precedent and a social commentary on the final chapter of an isolated, once powerful family. The resolution of these legal challenges required months of hearings, filings, and judicial rulings. Ultimately, the surrogates' court affirmed the validity of Mary Augusta Wendel's will, authorizing the liquidation of assets and the distribution of funds to the designated heirs and charitable institutions. The outcome, achieved only after exhaustive review and negotiation, underscored both the effectiveness and the limits of the legal frameworks that had governed the Wendel estate for nearly a century. The end of probate marked the beginning of a new phase, as the estate shifted from family stewardship to broader public and institutional control, closing a complex chapter in the history of Manhattan property and inheritance. Following the conclusion of the probate proceedings, the fate of the Wendel mansion and its associated properties was determined by the mandates of the will, the court's rulings, and the practical realities of a rapidly changing urban environment. The executors of the estate, acting in accordance with judicial orders and the hierarchy of beneficiaries established in Mary Augusta Wendel's testament, commenced the process of liquidating assets. This involved not only the disposition of securities and cash holdings but also, crucially, the sale of the family's extensive real estate portfolio in Midtown Manhattan. The most prominent of these transactions concerned the mansion at 442 Fifth Avenue, a property that, despite its architectural and historical significance, had become functionally obsolete amidst the district's commercial transformation. Official sale notices, property auction records, and contemporaneous news articles document the competitive bidding for the site, as developers and corporate interests sought to acquire one of the last remaining privately held parcels in the area. The final sale price reflected both the premium location and the property's potential for large-scale redevelopment. Once the transfer was completed, new owners wasted little time in filing applications for demolition permits. City authorities, noting the deteriorated condition of the building and its incongruity with the surrounding skyline, approved the plans without substantial opposition from preservationists, whose influence in municipal affairs was at that time limited. The demolition itself, carried out over several weeks in the mid-1930 seconds, was overseen by contractors specializing in the removal of large urban structures. Records indicate that the process was methodical, with salvaged materials inventoried and valuable architectural features either sold at auction or disposed of according to city regulations. Photographs published in local newspapers and the archives of city planning departments capture the gradual erasure of the brownstone's distinctive profile, replaced first by vacant lots and later by new construction. By the end of the decade, a modern commercial building stood in its place, housing retail establishments and offices that reflected the priorities of a modern metropolis. The liquidation of the Wendel real estate extended beyond the mansion itself. Dozens of properties, previously held as rental or investment assets, were sold at auction or through private negotiations. Beneficiaries named in the will, charitable institutions, distant relatives, and designated executors received distributions according to court-approved formulas. Municipal records and legal filings confirm that all outstanding tax obligations were satisfied in full and that no significant disputes delayed the completion of sales. The demolition and redevelopment of the mansion marked a definitive break with the past. With the physical structure erased and the land repurposed, the tangible evidence of a century of Wendel presence vanished from the cityscape. The process was reported with a mixture of nostalgia and pragmatism, as journalists and city officials acknowledged both the historical significance of the house and the inevitability of its removal in the face of urban progress. By the close of this chapter, the estate that had once served as a fortress for the Wendel sisters' privacy and control had been integrated into the broader economic and social currents of New York. The transition from family enclave to commercial development was executed with the same procedural rigor that had defined the management of the estate in earlier generations, but the consequences were irrevocable. The demolition of the mansion served as both a literal and symbolic endpoint for the Wendel legacy in Midtown Manhattan. In the years following the demolition of the Wendel mansion, the transformation of the family's former properties mirrored the larger patterns of urban renewal that defined mid-20th century New York. Once the site of an austere private residence, 442 Fifth Avenue rapidly became integrated into the commercial grid, its footprint subsumed by new construction projects that prioritized height, density, and economic utility. Building permits, city planning records, and commercial real estate advertisements from the late 1932s and early 1940s document a succession of proposals and completed developments, ranging from mid-rise office towers to mixed-use retail spaces. The replacement structures quickly established themselves as fixtures of the Midtown landscape, serving the needs of corporate tenants, retailers, and an increasingly transient urban population. The process of redevelopment was closely monitored by municipal authorities, whose objectives included the maximization of tax revenues and the alignment of building uses with the city's broader modernization efforts. Urban planning reports from the era emphasize the significance of repurposing legacy parcels such as the Wendel site, citing their potential to anchor further investment and to set precedents for the rationalization of land use in a district long characterized by a patchwork of ownership and architectural styles. The integration of the former Wendel properties into the city's infrastructure contributed to the continuing northward expansion of commercial activity along Fifth Avenue and reinforced the primacy of corporate interests over residential enclaves. As the new buildings rose, the last tangible connections to the Wendel family's long residence disappeared. Archival photographs and local press accounts note the speed with which the memory of the mansion faded from public consciousness. Former neighbors, most of whom had relocated or retired, offered only brief and factual recollections when interviewed by journalists or urban historians. The family name, once a discreet but consistent presence in local directories and property tax rolls, vanished from official records as the final parcels were transferred to institutional investors, trusts, and commercial entities. The estate's beneficiaries, including designated charities and distant relatives, received their distributions and soon ceased to play any active role in the ongoing affairs of the neighborhood. The absorption of the Wendel legacy into the city's commercial ecosystem reflected broader trends in New York's development. The decline of private residential dynasties in favor of public and corporate stakeholders, the consolidation of land ownership under large entities, and the gradual but inexorable replacement of individual histories by institutional narratives. Municipal authorities hailed the redevelopment as evidence of the city's vitality and adaptability, while preservationists and local historians, though few in number at the time, began to document the losses associated with such transitions. By the early 1940s, there remained no physical trace of the Wendel sisters' long occupation of Fifth Avenue. Their story, preserved in probate records, legal filings, and scattered press clippings, became a case study in the transformation of urban property and the absorption of individual fortunes into the larger economic and social currents of metropolitan life. The fate of the Wendel properties, emblematic of broader changes in Midtown Manhattan, set a template for the eventual redevelopment of similar enclaves throughout the city in the decades that followed. With the erasure of the Wendel mansion from the physical landscape and the final liquidation of the family's holdings, the story of the Wendel sisters passed into a new phase, one shaped less by documentation and more by recollection, rumor, and interpretation. In the decades following the mansion's demolition, journalists, local historians, and the occasional urban folklorist revisited the story as an illustration of both the peculiarities of inherited wealth and the social consequences of sustained withdrawal from public life. Periodicals from the 1,940 Seconds and 1,950 Seconds, as well as later works on New York's vanished families, frequently cited the Wendel sisters as examples of reclusiveness taken to an unusual extreme, contrasting their behavior with that of other contemporary heirs who sought prominence through philanthropy or civic engagement. This period also saw the emergence of myths surrounding the sisters' final years, with speculative narratives offered in place of the thorough legal and financial records that had defined previous decades. Urban legends suggested that the sisters had been afraid of outsiders, or that the mansion had been filled with hidden treasures and secret passageways, claims that found little support in the surviving estate inventories or municipal inspection reports. Interviews with former neighbors, tradespeople, and even retired police officers contributed only fragmentary memories, often colored by the passage of time and the influence of local gossip. The factual basis of the sisters' routines, careful management, strict privacy, and an aversion to change became conflated with the broader image of eccentricity and insularity. Academic interest in the Wendels persisted in specialized circles. Legal scholars cited the estate's probate case as a reference in discussions of succession law and the administration of large, undivided inheritances. Urban historians use the mansion's demolition as an example of the city's rapid and sometimes ruthless modernization, with the disappearance of such properties seen as symbolic of the broader replacement of individual and family narratives by those of institutions and markets. Publications from this era relied heavily on primary documents, probate filings, property records, and legal correspondence. Nevertheless, the gap left by the lack of personal testimony from the sisters themselves ensured that speculation and myth would become permanent features of the Wendel legacy. The persistence of the Wendel name in local memory was aided by occasional references in guidebooks and retrospectives on lost New York. The address at 442 Fifth Avenue, now occupied by commercial tenants, remained a point of curiosity for those interested in the city's social and architectural history. The story of the mansion and its last occupants provided material for lectures, articles, and even fictionalized accounts that further blurred the lines between history and legend. By the mid-20th century, the narrative surrounding the Wendel sisters had achieved the status of minor urban folklore. Their reputations, shaped as much by public imagination as by the documented facts of their lives, contributed to ongoing debates about the role of wealth, privacy, and legacy in a city defined by constant transformation. The contrast between the sisters' extreme seclusion and the vibrancy of the metropolis around them remained a subject of interest, ensuring that, even in absence, the Wendels retained a distinctive, if enigmatic, place in New York's collective memory. As the Wendel saga receded into the historical record, it became a frequent point of comparison for journalists, scholars, and legal professionals examining the broader phenomenon of American reclusive heirs and inherited estates. The case's unique intersection of legal discipline, property consolidation, and social withdrawal encouraged comparative analysis with other notable families who had also experienced the isolating effects of significant, undivided wealth. In the decades following the dissolution of the Wendel estate, researchers drew parallels with later episodes involving the Collier brothers in Harlem, whose own withdrawal and accumulation of property resulted in tragedy, as well as with the case of Huguette Clark, another Manhattan heiress who lived in private seclusion despite vast resources. In each instance, analysts highlighted both common features and distinguishing factors. The Wendels, unlike some of their counterparts, managed to retain professional oversight and fiscal control over their assets up until the final liquidation. Their approach was methodical, grounded in strict adherence to legal and financial best practices. Estate records and probate filings reveal an absence of debt, scandal, or significant mismanagement elements that often marked the downfall of similar fortunes. The Wendel sisters' legacy, while marked by personal withdrawal, was never associated with sensational headlines or criminal investigations. This administrative clarity set them apart from heirs who lost control to opportunists, distant claimants, or institutional authorities before their deaths. The social ramifications of inherited isolation also drew interest from sociologists and historians. Academic articles and conference proceedings from the mid to late 20th century analyzed the role of legal structures such as family trusts, restrictive covenants, and succession clauses in promoting patterns of privacy, insularity, and, in extreme cases, the abandonment of engagement with the outside world. The Wendel family's insistence on internal management, minimal staff, and the exclusion of potential heirs through strict marriage policies was seen as both a protective measure and a root cause of their eventual social invisibility. These choices, while effective in preserving the estate, contributed directly to the narrowing of familial relationships and the inability to adapt to changing social contexts. The cultural impact of the Wendels' withdrawal has also been examined alongside other case studies. In contrast to philanthropists who used inherited wealth to establish public legacies through museums, foundations, or civic projects, the Wendels left behind no institutions bearing their name. Their impact on the city, though significant in terms of property and financial influence, was ultimately absorbed into the urban fabric without enduring markers of family identity or public benefaction. This outcome has been cited in legal and historical literature as a cautionary example of the limits of private fortune, particularly when combined with deliberate non-engagement. By the turn of the 21st century, the Wendel case was widely referenced in legal textbooks, urban studies, courses, and historical monographs as a benchmark for understanding the risks and consequences of inherited seclusion. The administrative success of their estate stood in contrast to the personal and social costs of extreme privacy. This legacy, positioned within the wider context of American fortunes, contributed valuable insight into the intersection of law, wealth, and the persistent drive for autonomy even, and especially, at the expense of participation in public life. In the years that followed the liquidation of the Wendel estate, legal scholars, urban historians, and estate planners repeatedly returned to the case for its illustrative value. The story of the Wendel sisters became emblematic of both the potential and the perils inherent in the long-term consolidation of wealth within a single family, and in the rigid legal strategies that can simultaneously preserve and isolate. Case studies presented in law schools and professional conferences routinely cited the Wendel probate process as a model of precise documentation, proactive legal structuring, and unwavering adherence to established protocols. The sisters' insistence on the non-alienation of property and their use of trusts to ensure family control became touchstones for debates over the merits and risks of such approaches. The Wendel experience demonstrated the capacity of legal frameworks, wills, trusts, and restrictive covenants to maintain estate integrity for decades, even in the absence of direct heirs or active management by younger generations. However, the same mechanisms that insulated the assets from division and dispute also contributed to a growing disconnection from the evolving city. Urban historians noted that while the family's holdings appreciated in value as Manhattan developed, the lack of engagement with new economic opportunities or changing neighborhood dynamics led to a missed potential for both the estate and the city. The case became an argument for greater flexibility and adaptive strategies in estate planning, particularly in urban contexts subject to rapid demographic and economic change. The fate of the Wendel properties also offered lessons for municipal officials and urban planners. The transition from private residence to commercial development was executed efficiently after probate, but the process highlighted the challenges associated with large, undivided parcels held by absentee or disinterested owners. Reports from city planning agencies referenced the Wendel case when discussing policies to encourage redevelopment and prevent blight caused by underutilized legacy properties. The ultimate absorption of the estate into the commercial infrastructure of Midtown Manhattan was seen as both inevitable and, in retrospect, delayed by the family's reluctance to engage with outside actors. Legal literature surrounding the estate emphasized the value of clear succession plans and comprehensive documentation. The absence of serious debt, the prompt settlement of tax obligations, and the systematic approach to asset inventory all contributed to a relatively smooth probate process. Nevertheless, the costs of such rigid continuity were also acknowledged: the dissolution of the family, the loss of a potential philanthropic legacy, and the erasure of personal history from the urban landscape. Estate planners used the case as an example of the importance of balancing asset preservation with flexibility, community engagement, and mechanisms for gradual succession. By the latter half of the 20th century, the Wendel case had become a fixture in academic literature and professional discourse. It was cited not only for its procedural successes but also for the unintended consequences of its strategies, most notably the gradual isolation and eventual disappearance of both the family and its home. The lessons drawn from the Wendels continue to inform discussions of urban inheritance, property management, and the responsibilities of wealth in changing cities, offering both a guide and a warning to those entrusted with the stewardship of substantial legacies. Following the final liquidation and distribution of the Wendel estate, the social and civic consequences of the sisters' accumulated wealth became evident through a series of charitable bequests and court-directed contributions. While Ella and Mary Wendel had maintained strict privacy during their lifetimes and avoided any form of public philanthropy, their carefully drafted wills and, in some cases, the court's own discretionary allocations ensured that a portion of their fortune benefited a range of institutions across New York City. Probate files, legal notices, and reports from beneficiary organizations detail the redirection of millions of dollars in estate proceeds toward hospitals, educational initiatives, and various charitable foundations. Specific provisions within the sisters' wills named several long-standing institutions, including medical centers and local aid societies, as direct recipients of funds. Disbursement records from the early 1932s reflect the establishment of endowments and the construction of facilities that bore no outward sign of the Wendel name, in keeping with the family's aversion to publicity. In instances where the will's language was ambiguous or where distant family claims were resolved in favor of the community, the probate court exercised its authority to allocate funds to public purposes deemed consistent with the spirit of the Wendel legacy. These actions were documented in court orders, annual reports, and the minutes of charitable boards. The civic impact of these posthumous distributions was both immediate and diffuse. Hospitals and schools used the funds to expand services, purchase equipment, or subsidize care for the city's underserved populations. At the same time, the lack of visible Wendel patronage meant that the sisters' role in these improvements was rarely acknowledged by the beneficiaries or the broader public. Newspaper coverage from the period emphasized the scale of the donations, but generally framed them as a natural consequence of the estate's size rather than as a product of personal generosity or social engagement. Urban historians and nonprofit administrators later noted that the Wendel estate's eventual contributions, though indirect, played a role in the development of the city's social infrastructure during a period of economic uncertainty and transition. The family's silence during their lifetime was matched by a form of anonymous benefaction that left no personal legacy but contributed materially to the well-being of New Yorkers. In legal and philanthropic literature, the case stands as an example of how even the most private fortunes may, through the mechanisms of estate law and probate, enter the public sphere and shape civic life, if only after the passing of those who once held them in reserve. With the conclusion of the estate's distribution, the Wendel story closed, not with the creation of monuments or institutions bearing their name, but with the quiet, far-reaching effects of wealth redirected by legal process to meet the needs of a city in transformation. The legacy, while intangible and unheralded, provided a final chapter in the family's long and complex relationship with the community from which it had long withdrawn. The Wendel sisters' story stands as a singular case in the chronicles of American wealth. Their conscious choice to withdraw from society while maintaining meticulous control over a billion-dollar fortune ensured the preservation of their holdings but also led to their near-total disappearance from public life. The eventual demolition of their mansion and the absorption of their estate into the city's modern fabric marked the close of a chapter characterized by both discipline and detachment. The Wendel legacy endures as a lesson in the limits of inherited privilege and the unforeseen consequences of rigid succession. Today, their name remains an understated footnote in the ongoing narrative of New York's evolution, a reminder that even the most fortified fortunes may ultimately vanish from view, not through failure, but through deliberate silence.